Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on creating a fairer water hardship system. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in today. Next slide. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. I am on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara people here in Brisbane. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations people joining us in today's webinar. I would also like to welcome today's speakers, Lucy Kaur, who is from the Energy and Water Ombudsman Queensland, and Mary Flowers from Tenants, Queensland. Lucy has worked as an investigations officer for the Energy and Water Ombudsman Queensland for over 9.5 years. Through this experience, Lucy has become acutely aware of issues specifically impacting energy and water customers. Prior to EWOC, Lucy was with the financial counseling sector, where she worked with consumers experiencing financial hardship across a multitude of issues. Lucy believes that she's been fortunate to continue these ties with her past through EWOC, as they're dedicated to continuing conversations about hardship with the aim of improving outcomes for consumers. Welcome, Lucy. Mary has worked with tenants for about 15 years, having worked at a community legal centre in regional New South Wales for most of this time. She's been a long-term tenant and experienced a short period of homelessness herself after the floods of 2017. Mary works with vulnerable tenants, including those incarcerated in prisons in Queensland. One of her roles as the legal officer is to provide tenancy advice to other organizations who are supporting tenants in their roles. She also provides legal advice within Tenants Queensland to workers delivering services under the QCOSS program. Welcome, Mary, to today's webinar. I'm Gayatri. I'm the principal advisor for research at QCOSS, and I work on issues related to living affordability, gender, and water. In today's webinar, I will start by presenting the findings from our water hardship research, which is an overview of what provisions exist in legislation in Queensland relating to water hardship. And then I will hand over to Lucy and Mary, who will speak more about the issues that they see day in and day out with the clients accessing their services. Next slide. Before we start, here are some housekeeping instructions. So this event is being run in the Zoom webinar mode. You will be able to ask questions using the Q&A function that you will see at the bottom of your screen. You will also have the ability to comment and upvote each other's questions to maximize interactivity, and we will be moderating this. This session is being recorded, and we'll make it available for later viewing via the QCOSS website. So to provide a bit more context to the work that we're doing, QCOSS has been advocating for affordability and equity for water for many years. More recently, the data that came out of the 2020 Energy Charter Survey showed that water bills emerged as a key financial concern for Queenslanders during COVID-19. In addition to this, the Water Supply Association of Australia identified that increasing numbers of water consumers were experiencing hardship across most regions in Australia, and that existing hardship approaches offered by providers may be insufficient to provide the assistance required. So we did a deep dive into the hardship provisions that were applicable to regional Queensland providers, as well as hardship support being offered in practice. So our research had 4 main parts to it. The first one was we reviewed the legislation to identify hardship provisions that applied in regional Queensland. We compared the regional hardship provisions in regional Queensland to Southeast Queensland. We reviewed hardship indicators under performing reporting framework to determine what the scale of the problem was. And then we reviewed the sample of water provider websites to identify what support was being offered in practice. Next slide, please. So what are the hardship provisions and arrangements in relevant legislation? In Southeast Queensland, water consumers are protected by the Southeast Queensland Water and Wastewater Customer Code. However, this code does not apply to regional Queensland outside the Southeast Queensland region. So in regional Queensland, local councils typically bill for water as part of their rates notice. So under local government regulation, councils may offer a concession for water charges, but they're not required to do so. Councils can apply interest rate on overdue accounts, which is currently compounding at 8.53% from the day that they're overdue. There are no requirements per se to consider hardship issues before doing and levying the interest charges. Councils may recover overdue water charges by bringing court proceedings against the person liable. And if water charges remain unpaid for 3 years, council can sell the land. This doesn't mean that it's occurring in practice. Widely in practice, to do this, they issue a notice of intention to sell that sets out the total amount owing that must be paid within 3 months, or the land will go to auction. Next slide. Further, under the Water Supply Act and other legislation, councils must set customer service standards, but these don't necessarily include hardship service standards. Performance against the standard is also not very actively monitored. So the guidelines state that councils should include information about their hardship policy on water bills, but this is not required. Regional water consumers cannot access the Energy and Water Ombudsman Queensland, and complaints are handled by the Queensland Ombudsman, and Lucy will touch upon this a bit more when she speaks. And regional councils do not have the authority to disconnect or restrict water flow for non-payment of water bills. So how do these provisions compare to what exists in Southeast Queensland? In Southeast Queensland, under the Water and the Wastewater Customer Code, water providers must have a hardship policy to support customers experiencing financial difficulty. They must allow customers experiencing payment difficulties to pay an account by installments under a payment plan. They cannot charge interest on the debt customers are paying off under a payment plan, and cannot disconnect customers from water for non-payment, but they can restrict flow if they've not paid their bills. This is excluding some hardship cases. Providers must issue a reminder notice that includes advice about what help is available if they're experiencing financial difficulties. They must offer centre pay as a payment option for customers experiencing hardship, and water consumers in Southeast Queensland can access EWOC for complaints and disputes. So Lucy and Mary will talk a bit more in detail about what the practice looks like, but I just want to spend a few minutes on what the data we researched tells us. So we looked at 2 reporting frameworks, the Queensland KPI framework and the National Performance Framework. However, there are no hardship indicators per se that are collected. So there are 2 indicators collected under the NPR, the National Performance Reporting Framework, that relate to non-payment, which we can kind of use as proxies to understand what hardship provisions exist and what they look like in practice. The first one is the number of restrictions for non-payment, and second is the number of legal actions taken for non-payment. However, it's not very clear with these indicators if they're capturing any punitive measures that are being taken by local councils to recoup water debt. And we found 2 examples. For example, in February 2019, Cairns Regional Council did sell land due to unpaid rates and charges, but however, this was not really reported under the NPR. And we found 2 regional water providers that have reported under the NPR that applied flow restriction, but they didn't have an explicit head of power to do so. Next slide. We also did a bit of research on what councils' websites were telling us. We sampled 9 councils and found that 3 out of the 9 providers had a hardship policy in place on their website. Additional 3 councils introduced short-term hardship measures specific to COVID-19, and the remaining 3 councils had no hardship policy that was accessible on their website in place. Of the councils who had a hardship policy on their website, the main support offered was to waive interest charges on overdue amounts, freeze interest rate charges for a defined period of time, or suspend legal action. Additionally, most hardship policies included really comprehensive eligibility criteria, such as requiring the customer to agree to pay off the debt within 2 billing cycles, requiring the customer to authorize an accredited financial counselor to act on their behalf, requiring the customer to provide detailed information about their income, assets, liabilities, including superannuation balances, mortgage statements, credit statements, and bank balances, etc. And all of the websites that we mentioned said that they would charge an interest rate of 8.5% on overdue charges, although some had policies to waive these off for hardship cases. To conclude, we found that compared to regional Queensland, providers in regional Queensland didn't have specific practices related to hardship or payment difficulty. Regional providers could take punitive actions and can take punitive actions such as legal action. They can charge interest rates without any requirement per se to offer hardship support. In regional Queensland, because rates are bundled with water charges, councils do have the authority to sell a person's property to recover unpaid water debt. Some providers have voluntarily introduced hardship policies, but in many cases, this was just a short-term measure due to COVID-19. The absence of suitable hardship indicators in Queensland and the national performance really inhibits our ability to measure and track the scale of the problem for water hardship across the state. And lastly, there's a clear disparity between the experiences of regional water consumers and Southeast Queensland water consumers. So I will, just before I finish, I just wanted to mention that the detailed report is available on the QCOSS website. We also have a list of resources on our community door website that has up-to-date resources on water issues, including water tips for tenants in Queensland, what to do if we have a high water bill, and tips for saving water. So I will stop here for a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions or comments about the research, and then pass it over to Lucy. You can use the Q&A function to type in any questions you have. Rose has a comment. Good research and work. What will be the next steps now? Hi, Rose. So the next steps are, we are nearing completion to an interjurisdictional comparison of water provisions in across Australia. So we will be comparing how Queensland compares with other jurisdictions. And we will also be looking at identifying any best practices that come out of this research. And I think the key issues that we want to focus on are affordability and lack of equity across. There are different arrangements across the state, so we'll be looking at that as an issue. We'll be focusing on whether we can strengthen hardship reporting and customer service standards across the state, and then looking at how punitive actions can be, how hardship provisions can be considered before implementing any punitive actions. I think the last one is we are going to be looking at how tenants are impacted by hardship policies, because they are not covered directly by customer service standards in most cases. And we know from our work with low-income households that most low-income households do rent rather than own their properties. So yes, those are the next steps. Does anyone have any more questions or comments? Rose, does that? Yeah, with the advocacy, so Rose says, good to hear this. And what about the advocacy steps? So that is something that we're working on, but it will really closely touch upon looking at affordability and equity across Queensland, and to see how water hardship provisions can be introduced in either through the legislation or regulation, or through customer service standards and practice. Karen says, I truly believe landlords should be responsible for water usage up to a certain percentage, as this would take pressure off tenants. Yep, Mary can talk about that a bit more when she presents. Thanks, Karen. Okay, if there are no further questions, we'll go on to Lucy.
Thank you, Gayatri. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting the Energy and Water Ombudsman Queensland to this webinar. Obviously, we're very, very thrilled to take part in these conversations as well, and these are extremely hot topics for our office, and certainly we are truly aware of some of the shortfalls and shortcomings of the jurisdiction of our office, and hope that some of these can be redressed in the coming years as well. If we can go on to slide number 2, Maria. I'd firstly also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of and their custodianship of the lands, seas and waters where we meet today, and we recognise their continuing connection to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this morning, I'm just going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about what we do. A lot of you are already very familiar with the functions of the Energy and Water Ombudsman Queensland. We are a free, fair and independent dispute resolution service. We do assist customers to resolve their complaints with their electricity and gas providers throughout Queensland, and here in Southeast Queensland, their water providers. We have the power to receive and investigate complaints concerning high billing or estimated billing, hardship and other credit-related matters such as default listings, issues concerning disconnection or restriction of water supply, and that includes negotiating reconnection or arranging a hold on any of those actions. We can investigate whether rebates and concessions have been applied correctly, or range for refunds to be paid to customers. We can also look at application of concealed leak policies or damage to property incurred from sewage blockages and overflow, or actions taken by energy, gas or water providers. We can assist customers to establish payment plans, put a stop to debt collection and review default listing processes. We can also review poor customer service experiences, including incorrect or misleading information, unprofessional behaviour, breaches of privacy or poor communication. And we can certainly undertake investigations around denied claims for compensation for damages and losses. In our investigations, we would look to see whether there have been any errors or acts or omissions on behalf of the energy or water providers, and we would ensure that corrective action is taken. But we also have the power to assess whether the actions or the resolutions offered have been fair and reasonable. I guess when we look at matters such as financial hardship, we do understand that there are provisions within codes and legislation that do put a framework around how a hardship policy should look like, what the inclusions should be, minimum requirements. But we also would consider whether best practice has been applied in individual circumstances. And we may request for reconsideration of especially fees and charges that have been applied to customers' bills for reconnections or to remove restriction devices. We may look at whether that would be reconsidered by a energy or water provider. As you can imagine, a customer who's already experiencing financial hardship and struggling to meet the cost of their bill would find an additional fee, and I'm aware in some jurisdictions or in some spaces here in Southeast Queensland, to have a water restriction device removed from a property, there's an additional charge of $190. And if a customer already has an outstanding bill, struggling to make repayments on that, an additional $190 on top of those charges may seem overwhelming, may also indicate to a customer that there's not a sense of goodwill or understanding of their circumstances by the water provider. So we may, while acknowledging that there is the ability for these charges to be applied, we would also request whether there is any room for these to be removed in special consideration of an individual circumstance. If we can go on to the next slide, Maria. So just give you a brief snapshot of what our complaints look like in this year to date. And it's actually the year 21 to 22 year to date, not 21 as my slide seems to indicate. But in the past financial year, in the previous financial year, water complaints actually only comprised a total of 8% of the total complaints received by our office. In this current financial year, our complaint cases for water matters are currently sitting at about 6% of our total cases. So we do receive the majority of the complaints received by our office are to do with electricity issues. One of the contributing factors to that is our limited jurisdiction with investigating complaints, in which we can only receive complaints from water customers in the Southeast Queensland pocket. Out of the 237 water-related cases that we've received to date in this financial year, 153 of those relate to billing disputes, and only 6 specifically relate to financial hardship or credit-related issues. This number isn't really indicative of the hardship that is experienced by customers, as we do find that billing-related disputes often mask payment issues or financial hardship issues. Now, these might be long-term financial hardship, it might be short-term, it might be an unusual event which has created a payment difficulty, but the number of complaints that we do receive specifically about credit is not limited to those cases which are all about credit. One of the issues that we do see regularly is when a customer experiences a concealed leak at their property, and it might result in a water bill of $1,400, $14,000, $60,000. It is all dependent on the extent of that leak and the velocity or volume of water that is being lost throughout that time. It would also depend on how long that leak has been undetected for. And in one circumstance, we did receive a complaint from a young family living in a regional area of the Gold Coast who had a leak on their property for a substantial period of time, but the water was actually running down into a back stream. So it wasn't being able to be picked up by any leak detection that they had on the property itself. So by the time they did become aware of it, the leak itself and the financial impact was so significant that it created a significant financial hardship for that young family. We would also, our complaint numbers also can be impacted by other factors, such as the extent of assistance that's already been provided by a water provider, a customer not being aware of EWOC services or having accessibility to our services. There is also the customers who are in denial of their circumstances or really not wanting to confront the reality of their situation. And this can be for a number of reasons. The overwhelming sense of what is going on for them, as well as the embarrassment that they might be feeling about not being able to manage their level of debt, just feeling in over their heads by the whole situation. So there are a lot of reasons why our water complaints might be low, and especially those that are related to credit specifically. As I've touched on before, our office can only provide assistance to a small number of water customers in Queensland. There are restrictions on our functions, and we do not provide we cannot provide access to all water customers within Queensland, and therefore all water customers in Queensland do not have that equitable or equal access to free dispute resolution services. Maria, if we can go on to the next slide. So the restrictions on our functions are such that we cannot investigate complaints from water consumers who use over 100 kilolitres of water per annum, and this eliminates the small to mid-size, large-size business customers as well, even mum and dad business owners who may still be a relatively small business, but their water consumption exceeds that 100 kilolitres per annum. Water issues outside of Southeast Queensland. So we currently only have jurisdiction to investigate complaints from water customers in the Unity Water, Urban Utilities, Redland, Logan and Gold Coast City Council regions. So this really is putting not providing access to dispute resolution opposed to Queensland Ombudsman, but to our services to regional or rural customers outside of that southeast pocket. We also can't take complaints regarding water pricing disputes and tenants who are being passed on charges from their landlords. And we recognise this as being a very vulnerable consumer group for the reasons of that a tenant is not necessarily as engaged with water consumption at a property and requirements or their responsibilities to review a meter or check internal plumbing as an owner-occupied property might be. They're also most likely to be unaware of an issue until they receive that really large pass-through charge from their real estate or their landlord directly that might relate to a concealed leak. And quite often they will not have any ability to be able to liaise with their water provider directly because they're not an account holder. And then this would restrict their ability from being able to access concealed leak remission or even a direct payment plan. So we do recognise that tenants are a particularly vulnerable sector, and especially when it comes to water-related issues. Our office also can't review complaints concerning the fairness of a hardship or a concealed leak policy. We can ensure that this aligns with the requirements under specific legislation or codes of practice, but we certainly can't review whether they are fair. We also are limited in being able to compel a water provider to step outside the confines or how their policy is written. But once again, we certainly would encourage providers to consider above their policies what may be considered best practice in each individual circumstance. We also can't investigate complaints concerning bulk hot water supplies, and these are very specific to the unit complexes, a single point of water heating that is then distributed amongst each individual unit complex. And although we've recently taken on responsibilities with embedded networks, we still don't have jurisdiction with bulk hot water supply. And we do see these as a rather pressing issue amongst consumers. We will endeavour, even when we cannot take on a complaint, we will endeavour to refer a customer appropriately and we usually do know where to send them to, but we do find that it is quite, there is quite a gap in the water industry as to where consumers can go. And quite often it does take a consumer to be quite resourceful in order to access their rights under Queensland Ombudsman or through QCAT or the RTA as such. So obviously, if we had a greater jurisdiction, it would certainly make a water consumers' access to these same consumer protections more equitable. There is also a restriction on our functions when there has been the commencement of legal proceedings. Now, with the young family that I referred to earlier, who did make contact with our office, it was a long way down the track that they actually did make contact to us. And they did have a water bill that was in excess of $25,000. And by the time they had also contacted our office, legal proceedings had commenced. There had been a claim issued. And we were also restricted from becoming involved at that point. We did, however, make contact with the provider, the water provider, and review what type of contact there had been, what type of assistance had been provided, and whether that could be extended to, even though there had been a formal claim that had been decided by a court, we did look at what sort of other options there were for that customer at the time. He was offered further hardship and payment options, which were in line with affordability. Unfortunately, with this particular case too, we were contacted around 12 months later by the same customer, and he had not been able to maintain the payments as required, and subsequent enforcement action had commenced. And this particular case had gone beyond our ability to be able to assist. And we did again make contact with the provider, and we were able to recognise there had been extensive contact attempts from the water providers perspective to reach out and to try and keep this customer connected with them. And this, unfortunately, is a very common and recurring theme within our investigations, that we do see that there is, generally speaking, the water providers down in our southeast Queensland pocket do reach out extensively to their customers, and there is a lot of contact or a lot of contact attempts before other action is taken to either prompt the customer to return contact, such as a water restriction device being placed on the property, or subsequent legal action. So that is a positive from, I guess, our perspective here. We do often see that there is best practice. However, I think we're always looking for that one step further. And even though it feels as though all options have been exhausted, what else might be able to be offered in these circumstances? I really want to open the floor to questions and comments because I'm really not a speak to a slide type of person, and I'm a speak to a person type of person. So if there are any questions that anybody has that you want to raise through our Q&A, please send those through. Maria, what I'd like to do is put up next our last slide, which is ways to access our service. We've recently expanded our online presence. We've actually just gone on Instagram too to connect with the youth market. Very exciting for us. But we also have commenced our online chat. And this is a real-time chat function between our hours of operation, 8:30 in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, recognizing that there might be some barriers to customers wanting to pick up the phone and speak to us, and trying to make the contact with our office as easy and seamless as possible. We also do receive the majority of our complaints still by our 1-800 number, and we do have email contact through complaints at EWOC, and customers can go online and submit a complaint through our online portal. Please feel welcome to take our details down, and if there are any customers that you believe that can be referred onto our office, we are wanting to hear from these people, because we do find that we often see people experiencing financial hardship too late, and once further action has been taken. But options for support and assistance are far greater if we have that ability to intervene a lot earlier in the process. Gayatri, are there any questions that are coming through?
Not yet, Lucy. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A and the chat function. So if anyone has any questions for Lucy, can you either use the Q&A or the chat function, please?
Right.
There are not, yeah. No questions for you, Lucy. Your presentation was excellent. Thank you so much for walking us through EWOC's functions and your remit and the experiences of some of your customers who you provide services to. The chat function and the QA will be open till the end of the our webinar. So if you think about something, just type in your questions or comments there, and I will direct to Lucy or Mary as appropriate. We can move on to Mary now.
Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'll keep talking unless I get an acknowledgement that I can't be heard. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have and continue to suffer from the laws and policies imposed on them by decision makers in this country on land which belongs to them and was taken from them. As a result, First Nations people continue to be overrepresented in many areas of the legal system. I acknowledge elders who are no longer here and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. I further acknowledge emerging First Nations leaders who are using their voices to teach us about the importance of Aboriginal culture for all Australians. I'd like to thank QCOSS for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. My area of expertise is tenancy law, and can we just move on to the next slide, please? So just a little bit about Tenants Queensland, where I work. We are a community legal centre. There are some community legal centres in Australia which are more generalist. We are a specialist community legal centre, and our area of expertise is in tenancy law. Community legal centres are really focused on the vulnerable people, the disadvantaged people who don't have many available resources. So we have different workers within our organisation listed there on the slide there. When people call Tenants Queensland for the first time, they either come through the admin line or they come through the QCOSS line. And on the other side, I've just listed the QCOSS service, which many people are familiar with. This is where calls come in from tenants or from other organisations who are seeking tenancy advice. And this is where our QCOSS offices are located through the state. We also have a worker situated in Mount Isa, and she does work on the intake and advice line. Our workers go out into the community and talk to different organisations and different groups of people as well. We have a particular focus on domestic and family violence, and a lot of that arose out of COVID, but it continues on now as the Residential Tenancies and Rooming Accommodation Act incorporated permanent changes covering tenants who are impacted by domestic and family violence. Just move on to the next slide. So I've just listed the legislation here that some of the legislation we deal with. The 5 pieces of legislation in blue are the main areas that our organisation gives advice under. But for the purposes of this presentation today, there's been some other legislation to look at, and this is not a definitive list here. We do often delve into many other areas of local, state and federal law. So the next slide looks at, if we can move on to that one. So these are the issues that tenants contact us about. They're certainly not the only issues, but these 6 points cover most of the areas that we cover. I'm wondering if it's possible to open that first link when we look at liability for water. No, not that one. Just the link there. So when we're looking at liability for payment for water, this is where the first place we go to. So if we can scroll down to the clause 17, which back up again. Sorry, item 12 it is. I'm jumping the gun here. If we go right up, this is an 18A general tenancy agreement, and we're looking at item 12. Okay, so see here, the services supplied to the premises which the tenant must pay for. So 12.2, it says, is the tenant to pay for water supplied to the premises? That's either ticked yes or no. And so this is the first place we go to. Sometimes we look at a tenancy agreement, there's nothing ticked there. So if we go down to clause 17, which is further down, keep going, that's item 17. Clause 17 is further down. All right, so it's just coming up now. So clause 17 looks at water service charges. Okay. All right, so it's quite clear here in the general tenancy agreement about what the tenant is responsible for. And so if that box is ticked, as I just referred to, then this is what the tenant's responsible for. But they only have to pay for water where there is water efficiency, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Water efficiency measures, and if the property is separately metered. Sometimes that's not clear right from the first point of a tenant contacting our service for advice. So this is the first place we look at in determining whether a tenant is liable to pay water. So we might investigate with the tenant's assistants issues around water meters and sub-meters. We've certainly had a tenant recently in regional Queensland contact us where a sub-meter was attached to the meter illegally. And so, and then there was an attempt to on-charge the tenant for water. So these are the sorts of questions that we might get to deal with here in our work with tenants. If we can go back to that original slide. All right. So one of the other things that we get contacted about reasonably regularly are around water bills. Now, as we've already determined, the water bill gets sent to the owner of the property because the owner of the property or the lessor is the account holder. And the account holder is then required to pass that bill on to the real estate agent if there is an agent managing the property, or directly to the tenant if the owner is managing the tenancy. There's all sorts of issues that can arise out of the timeliness of that happening. And so we do know of tenants who get 2 years worth of water bills at one time, which automatically would put them into circumstances of hardship. Many of our tenants who are on low incomes. And what has the tribunal said about this? So these matters do end up before the tribunal. So two issues here. One is that the Residential Tenancies and Rooming Accommodation Act has a 6-month time limit for actions to come before the tribunal for breach. So if a tenant doesn't pay the water bill and there's an issue of breach, but if you've got 2 years worth of water bills, then there's an argument there that they're out of time to do that. The other issue is section 362 as referred to in this case on the slide, where the tribunal appeal panel determined that presenting water invoices in a non-timely manner is not an example of the owner mitigating their loss. So there's an obligation to mitigate in the legislation. So that's what the tribunal has found. Of course, not everybody knows about tribunal findings. That's our job to know this and to inform tenants about. So we can also get contacted about water leaks, and you can have obvious water leaks like, you know, leaking taps, perhaps less obvious leaks like a leaking toilet, or then the not obvious ones which Lucy talked about, which is concealed leaks. So they're all areas we can we give advice about and provide advocacy. Water-related repairs. So if a tenant can't get repairs for their water leaks or other water issues, then the first step is, after notifying the owner or the real estate agent, is to lodge a Form 16 for dispute resolution with the RTA, and hopefully the matter is resolved at that point. If not, then it would be an application to the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal to ask for an order to carry out those repairs. And often there's also an order for some sort of compensation for the tenant for the loss of the amenity and also compensation towards a huge water bill they might be getting. And the other issue that comes up too is water efficiency. And I know you put that slide up before, but we have a look at the next slide, water efficiency. The legislation covers water efficiency. This is just an example of a compliance form which comes from a plumber. So this is a tenant can request to see one of these to know that the property is water compliant. And this would be part of evidence that if we were going to the tribunal or assisting a tenant with this, that we would be looking for such a certificate that a plumber has seen the property and has can verify that it is water compliant. Therefore, the tenant is can be responsible for paying for the water for the property. So it's just a question that's come up for Karen. What rights do tenants have if the landlord doesn't provide an invoice for the payment of water? Well, if there's no invoice provided to a tenant, then the tenant can't pay. Sorry, I missed, there was more to that. What rights do tenants have if the landlord doesn't provide an invoice for a significant period of time? If it's in the lease agreement that a tenant is responsible for water, does the landlord have to provide an invoice for payment, and how far back can they claim the water costs? So Karen, just to answer that question, if it is in the lease agreement, it is the responsibility of the landlord or the property owner or the real estate agent to pass those bills on. A tenant can't pay a water bill blindly without seeing the relevant documentation, which would be the utility bill that's provided. And they only have to pay for the water usage if they're required to pay in the first place, and all of those other relevant factors apply, that there's no leaks and the property is water efficient. So how far back can they go? Well, I think the tribunal has made it clear that invoices have to be provided in a timely fashion. When they are provided, the tenant has 1 month to pay that water account unless they can come to some arrangement to pay it off more slowly, particularly if it's a large bill. So we are confident telling tenants that, you know, if bills are slow to come in, that's on the owner and the real estate agent, not on the tenant. I hope that answers your question. So I'm aware of the time. I'm going to cover the next section fairly quickly. Now, I'm not sure whether many people know about the Human Rights Act, but Queensland is one of 3 states that has a Human Rights Act. So Victoria and the ACT are the other 2 states. And it's a relatively new piece of legislation. And as workers in this space, we have a role to really promote this act and have these discussions within the public sector about human rights. So if we look at the next slide and look at the entities that have obligations under this act. So it doesn't apply to everybody. So these are some of the places that it applies to. So really public entities. And particularly with regard to the research that was presented today, dot point number 2 is very relevant here, that local councils, the individual councillors and employees are covered by this act. And moving on to the next slide. So functional public entities are also covered by the Human Rights Act. And these can be, these are organisations, companies, corporations who are doing the work of government. So people who are funded by the government to provide services. So they are all caught as well. So one example of that is the NDIS providers who are covered. They are providing services to the public on behalf of the government. So, there's quite a wide scope here. So moving on to the next slide, what responsibilities are there? So section 58 is the relevant section here. So when we're talking about public entities and functional public entities, under section 58, they have to give consideration to human rights and make decisions in a way that is compatible with human rights. So when you're making decisions about the supply of water and how that impacts on owners of property or tenants living in a property, the Human Rights Act can apply to that. So the next slide looks at some of the different sections where hardship might be considered under the Human Rights Act. And I won't read it all out, and you'll have the benefit of these slides to have a look at later. But so these are some of the other areas and some of the areas that we might use. So for example, if I was going to write a human rights complaint to an organisation or a government department, I would look at the different sections of the Human Rights Act to see which ones apply, and I would make the complaint under those sections. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to bring to your attention the Central Highlands Regional Council, which is featured in the research. They have a human rights policy, and I won't, it's linked there, but I won't go to it now. That policy, if you have a look at it, it really replicates what the Human Rights Act says. It doesn't apply it to the council's decision making. So it's good that they have one. And I think that because they have one, it really does lend itself to organisations and individuals using their rights under the Human Rights Act to and their policy to make complaints, and particularly around the issues of hardship. The council also has a company that provides housing, and that's quite common in some regional parts of Queensland. There are on the board of this housing company, individual councillors are caught by this because the individual councillors from the council are on the board of the housing company. They also have obligations under the Residential Tenancies and Rooming Accommodation Act. So my final slide is just about a complaint. So to make a human rights complaint, you can write to the public entity. So if it's the council supplying water and taking steps, you write to them. They have 45 days to respond to demonstrate that they have considered the Human Rights Act. If there is no response or it is an inadequate response, then the next step is a complaint to the Queensland Human Rights Commission. There is then they carry out some different stages of inquiry. At the moment, it's not the the be all and end all, because there is at the moment a 6-month delay in looking at new complaints coming in. But I would encourage everyone here to consider the Human Rights Act and how it might apply to the work that you do with vulnerable people. So thank you. I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. That was such an excellent presentation, and really loved you're bringing the human rights lens into the water hardship debate. I'm sure there's a lot to think about. We are out of time, but Rose has just got one question. I think that was for you, Mary, which is there any obligation on the landlord or real estate to alert the tenant of the usage increases significantly, such as in the case of a concealed leak?
Well, they may not be aware of it. An owner may not be aware of it, but if generally the tenant becomes aware of it, if there's a significant increase from previous bills to the present bill, and if that's the case. I mean, they may pick it up, but in the busy lives of owners and real estate agents, they may not pick it up. But a tenant presented with a large amount of a water bill is probably the first one that's going to pick that up. So they would go back to the owner and ask for, that to be investigated.
Can I just add to that too? I'm aware in Southeast Queensland that water providers have started sending consumption letters to the property, and it's addressed to the household. So after the reads have been taken, a notice is obviously a bill is prepared for the homeowner, but another notice is sent directly to the property, to the householder, advising them what the water consumption is. And there's a comparison graph as well. Now, this is generally speaking just to advise how much water has been consumed, but that graph can indicate whether there has been a high usage. There has been high usage compared to last read or last year for the person living in the property to be aware as well.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Mary. I think we just got, is that QUU only?
I don't believe it's just urban utilities. I could be wrong on that. I definitely know it is urban utilities. I have a feeling, and if there's anyone from Unity Water to tell me I'm wrong, that this is also occurring in Unity Water areas as well.
Thanks, Lucy. So we're out of time with today's session. Maria's just popped in a poll, and I would just like to take a few seconds to really thank Lucy and Mary for generously sharing your knowledge on water issues. I'd like to thank all the participants who asked questions and for participating. We will share the slides and everything that's been, all the resources that were discussed in today's presentation. But if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us and we will direct your query. Thank you very much again, and have a lovely rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, Gayatri.